The sun had barely risen over the cold Atlantic waters off Nova Scotia when an extraordinary scene unfolded. American fishing vessels, some of which had cast their nets in these waters for generations, suddenly found themselves flanked by Canadian Coast Guard ships. The message was unmistakable. The era of unchecked American fishing in Canadian waters was over. By order of Ottawa, these vessels were escorted out, stunned captains watching the coastline slip further into the distance. What had seemed impossible only days ago became a stark new reality, and at the heart of it all was one man, Mark Carney. Carney, a seasoned central banker who once steered both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England through turbulent economic storms, was not a politician by trade. Yet in this moment, he emerged as the architect of a bold Canadian countermove in an escalating economic war with the United States. Hours earlier, at midnight, he had signed into law the Marine Protection Zones Act, a sweeping measure that redefined Canada's control over its territorial waters. What appeared to be an environmental initiative was, in fact, a masterstroke of economic strategy, and its ripple effects were already shaking Washington to its core. To understand how Canada reached this point, one must rewind 3 months. The spark came when Donald Trump imposed a 35% tariff on Canadian lumber products, a decision that sent shockwaves across Canada's economy. Lumber towns reeled, exporters scrambled, and policymakers searched for a way to strike back. Yet Carney, unlike many leaders who might have opted for a retaliatory tariff, saw the futility of meeting fire with fire. As international trade expert Dr. Elizabeth Harper of the University of Toronto explained, tariff wars almost always favor the larger economy. The United States had sheer scale on its side. If Canada followed Trump's playbook, it would lose. Carney understood this. He needed a battlefield where America's size was not an advantage, but a liability. That battlefield was the sea. Carney tasked Canadian Maritime Minister Sarah Thompson with a deep investigation into fisheries and marine resources. The report her team produced was nothing short of explosive. For decades, American fleets had dominated Canadian waters, hauling out 73% of the total catch while leaving Canada with just 8% of the economic value. The imbalance was staggering. Even worse, satellite tracking showed systematic overfishing by American vessels, including illegal entry into spawning grounds and exceeding quotas year after year. Fish populations, cod, salmon, lobster, were collapsing. Environmentalists had sounded alarms for years, but only now were the economic consequences laid bare. The study concluded that with sustainable management, Canadian waters alone could generate $4.5 billion annually for coastal communities. This revelation was Carney's opening. Instead of a tariff tit for tat, he would use America's own dependence on Canadian fish against it. The Marine Protection Zones Act was his weapon. Its structure was elegant and devastating. First, nearly half of Canadian territorial waters, including some of the richest fishing grounds, the Grand Banks, George Bank, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, were reclassified as Ecological Protection Zones. Second, foreign vessels were banned entirely from these areas. Third, Carney anchored the act within international environmental agreements like the Paris Climate Accord and UN sustainability goals. Washington could scream economic sabotage, but on paper, Canada was championing ocean conservation. To oppose it was to oppose global environmental protection. The timing and preparation were impeccable. Environmental NGOs such as Greenpeace and WWF immediately hailed the act as visionary. Renowned marine scientists released papers supporting the move, providing it with scientific legitimacy. Coastal communities promised funding for new processing facilities and sustainable fishing practices, rallied behind the law. Canada was united, while America was caught flat-footed. In Washington, chaos erupted. Commerce Secretary Michael Reynolds denounced the act as economic aggression, but lawyers quickly warned the White House that challenging it at the World Trade Organization would be nearly impossible. WTO rules carve out broad exemptions for environmental protection, and Canada's legislation fit perfectly within those bounds. When Trump learned of the move, sources say he erupted, shouting that American fishermen had been casting nets there since before Canada was even a country. Yet legal advisors told him the harsh truth. Carney had outmaneuvered him. The economic consequences for the U.S. fishing industry were immediate and brutal. In New England, where coastal towns depend on access to Canadian waters, panic spread. Nearly 40% of the fleets in Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire suddenly lost their most profitable fishing grounds. The American Fishermen's Association estimated 30,000 jobs at risk, with a $3 billion industry in jeopardy. For many small family-owned fishing businesses, already battered by high fuel prices and foreign competition, this was the final blow. Fish processing plants along the Atlantic seaboard began bracing for closure. Blue Ocean Seafood in New Bedford, Massachusetts, warned that without Canadian fish, its thousands of workers would face layoffs. "This is our Pearl Harbor," declared CEO James McKenzie. Consumers, too, would soon feel the sting. Industry analysts projected seafood prices in American supermarkets would spike by 15 to 30%. Lobster, cod, and salmon, staples of New England cuisine, would soar in cost, adding hundreds of dollars to families' annual food bills. Popular restaurant chains like Red Lobster scrambled to adjust, forced to consider menu changes and price hikes. While the U.S. scrambled, Canada stood on the verge of a renaissance. Fishing communities in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, long in decline since the cod collapse of the 1990s, now faced new prosperity. Cooperatives formed, investments in local processing facilities surged, and technology firms specializing in sustainable fishing prepared for expansion. For every direct job on the water, 5 more in processing and distribution could follow. Carney's law was not only protecting fish stocks but also building a new economic foundation for Canada's coastal towns. Yet Carney's brilliance lay not just in economic foresight, but in strategic symmetry. Trump had justified steel tariffs on national security grounds. Carney now justified fishing restrictions on environmental sustainability. Both invoked sovereign rights. But while Trump's rationale clashed with global trade norms, Carney's aligned seamlessly with international environmental commitments. The contrast was stark, and it played to Canada's diplomatic advantage. In fishing towns across Maine and Massachusetts, anger boiled. Generational fishermen like Michael Turner, whose family had plied the Gulf of Maine since the 1890s, suddenly saw their way of life under threat. His boat, the Northern Star, designed for Canadian waters, was useless in deeper U.S. zones. "My father, my grandfather, they all fished here," Turner lamented. "Now they're telling us these waters aren't ours anymore. What do we do?" It was not just an economic crisis, but a cultural one, striking at the heart of New England's identity. Meanwhile, in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canadian fishermen like Peter Mackenzie expressed cautious optimism. "The Americans have been taking the best fish for decades. Maybe now we finally get our chance." His words captured the quiet pride spreading through Canadian fishing communities. For once, the tide seemed to be turning in their favor. Analysts suggest Carney's move may only be the beginning. Leaked documents hint at similar protection zones planned for Canada's Pacific coast and even the Great Lakes. Such measures would further tighten the noose around American fishing operations, creating a cascading economic shock that Washington could not easily counter. More intriguingly, other countries with rich fishing grounds, Mexico, Norway, Japan, have already contacted Canadian officials to study the legal framework. If replicated globally, the U.S. fishing industry could face unprecedented isolation. Economic journalist Jennifer Roberts of the Wall Street Journal noted that Carney's act signals a new era of trade wars. The battlefield is no longer confined to tariffs and quotas. Nations are beginning to weaponize natural resource management, environmental protections, and scientific justifications. Global economic diplomacy, she argued, is being rewritten before our eyes. And so, the scene that played out off Nova Scotia's coast was more than a simple expulsion of American fishing boats. It was the opening move in a grand strategic chess match. Carney had rewritten the rules, turning an environmental shield into an economic sword. Canada, often seen as the smaller player beside its southern neighbor, had demonstrated that with intelligence, timing, and creativity, even a middle power could punch far above its weight. As Washington's emergency meetings drag on and Canadian fishermen prepare for their first season under the new rules, one truth is undeniable. The balance of economic power in North America is shifting. Trump began this contest with tariffs on steel and aluminum, but Carney has escalated it to a new and unexpected battlefield: the ocean. In doing so, he has proven that in modern economic warfare, victory belongs not just to the strongest, but to the shrewdest. The world now watches to see whether Canada's Marine Protection Zones Act will spark imitation abroad or retaliation from the United States. One thing, however, is already certain. This moment marks the dawn of a new era in trade disputes, where natural resources, environmental laws, and global public opinion become as powerful as tariffs or sanctions. And at the center of it stands Mark Carney, the central banker who dared to play the world's oldest game of survival, the struggle for resources, but on entirely new terms.